The book hit the floor before she could catch it. Zelda Sutton stood frozen in the doorway of the ranch's back bedroom, her fingers still curled in the shape of the novel she had been clutching for the better part of 3 miles of dusty road. And she stared at the man in the bed, as though she had never truly seen a human being broken before. Not like this. Not so thoroughly, so brutally, so completely, that the sight of him made her own chest ache as if the injury were shared. Vance Prout was staring at her with eyes the color of storm clouds after lightning, and those eyes were blazing with something that was not pain, though pain was certainly there too, layered deep beneath everything else. What burned on the surface was fury. Raw, humiliated, wounded fury. "Get out," he said. His voice was the kind of low that meant it would not get louder, and that somehow made it worse. Zelda did not move. She had come because his foreman, a weathered man named Gideon, had ridden to town with his hat in his hands and desperation plain on his face, telling her that the cattleman was refusing the doctor's visits, refusing the laudanum, refusing food unless someone left it outside the door and knocked twice, and that he had not spoken a full sentence to any living soul in 11 days. 11 days since the stampede had pinned him under 800 pounds of terrified longhorn and shattered 3 of his ribs, dislocated his shoulder, and left him with a gash along his left side that the doctor had stitched closed with whiskey and prayer, and not much else. 11 days of silence and refusal. "I heard you the first time," Zelda said, bending down to retrieve the book. She straightened, smoothed the cover of it against her skirt, and met his eyes directly. "I am not leaving." Something shifted in his face then. Not softening, nothing so simple as that. It was more like a wall being tested and finding that the stones were not quite as solid as they had appeared from the outside. "You have no business being in this room," he said. "You have no business wasting away in it," she replied. "And yet here we both are." She pulled the chair that sat against the wall closer to the bedside. It scraped against the floorboards with a sound that was almost apologetic. She sat down, settled her skirt, opened the book to its first page, and began to read aloud. She would think later, much later, when everything between them had already changed irrevocably, that the moment she began reading was the moment the story truly started. Not the stampede, not the broken bones, not even the strange and combustible silence that had stretched between 2 near strangers in a sickroom at the edge of the New Mexico Territory in the autumn of 1881. The story started with her voice filling that room, and with him choosing, despite everything, not to make her stop. Zelda Sutton had arrived in Las Cruces 3 months before any of this happened, which was to say she arrived in late July of 1881 on the afternoon stage from Santa Fe, with 2 trunks, 14 books, a small amount of money that she intended to make last a very long time, and a specific kind of composure that came not from ease but from practice. She had learned to appear calm the way some people learn to appear wealthy, carefully, consistently, at some personal cost. She had come because her father's sister, her Aunt Rosalie, had written to her in Cincinnati with an offer that was part invitation and part lifeline. Rosalie ran a boarding house on the edge of town, a clean, respectable establishment that housed a schoolteacher, 2 railroad surveyors who came and went like weather, and a widow named Mrs. Farnsworth, who had been there so long she had effectively become furniture. Rosalie was getting older, and her hands gave her trouble, and she needed help with the books and the cooking and the general management of things, and she was willing to provide room and board in exchange. Zelda had said yes before she had finished reading the letter, because the alternative was staying in Cincinnati, and staying in Cincinnati meant staying in the same city as the man she had been engaged to for 2 years, before discovering, at the worst possible moment, that he had been carrying on a sustained and deliberate deception that had made her feel like the greatest fool in the state of Ohio. His name was Edmund, and she did not think about him anymore. She had decided this with the firm, practical resolution of someone who has been deeply hurt and has no intention of providing that hurt with any more real estate in her mind than it has already claimed. The West was new, and it was dry, and it was loud in ways she had not expected. Not loud like a city, but loud like the land itself had a voice and was not particularly interested in being quiet for anyone's comfort. She found she liked it more than she had anticipated. There was a directness to everything here that appealed to something in her nature that Cincinnati had always tried to polish away. She met Vance for the first time at the general store, where she had gone to purchase thread, and he had come in behind her, boots dusty to the knee, hat pushed back on his head, with the immediate and total atmosphere of a man who knows exactly where he is going and exactly what he needs when he gets there. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two beyond, with a jaw that looked like it had been put together out of strong opinions and stubbornness, and dark hair that the sun had lightened at the edges. He had looked at her the way people look at strangers in small towns, which was to say with complete and undisguised assessment. And then he had nodded, purchased his rope and his nails, and whatever else was on his list, and walked back out into the blazing New Mexico afternoon. She had asked the storekeeper who he was. Vance, the storekeeper said, as though the name explained everything, and perhaps in Las Cruces it did. Runs the Doubleback Ranch 15 miles east. Good man, keeps to himself. She had filed this away and not thought particularly much about it. She had seen him perhaps 4 or 5 times after that, the way you see people repeatedly in a town small enough that coincidence and population density do the same work. And on each occasion, they had exchanged the brief, courteous acknowledgments appropriate to near strangers, and nothing more. She had not thought he was unfriendly exactly. She had thought he was contained, the way a well-built fence is contained, holding something in rather than simply marking a boundary. It was Gideon who changed everything, coming to her specifically because Rosalie had apparently mentioned, at the church social 2 weeks prior, that her niece was a great reader and had a particular talent for being calm in situations where calmness was in short supply. Rosalie had not known she was providing a character reference that would result in her niece being dispatched to a cattle ranch to read to a man who did not want to be read to. But that was how things moved in small places. Sideways, through connections, through reputation, through the particular gravity of need. So Zelda had packed the book, which was a copy of Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd that she had already read twice and loved deeply, and she had gone. The first reading session lasted 45 minutes. Vance said nothing throughout it. He lay in the bed with the stillness of a man who has decided that if he holds himself rigid enough the pain will have less purchase, and he stared at the ceiling, and his jaw was set in a way that suggested he was enduring her presence rather than welcoming it. But he did not tell her to stop again. She read until the light from the window began to go golden and amber and she could feel the day tipping toward evening, and then she closed the book at the end of a chapter and stood up. "I will come back tomorrow," she said. Silence. "The same time," she added. More silence, but a different quality of it. Something in the set of his shoulders had changed, barely perceptibly, but she had grown up with a watchful father and 2 brothers, and she had learned to read the language of bodies that did not intend to be read. She left, and on the ride back to town in Gideon's wagon, she looked at the landscape going purple in the evening light and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the particular and cautious interest of a person who suspects they are standing at the edge of something significant. She came back the next evening, and the evening after that. By the fourth evening, Gideon reported to her at the door with a look of barely concealed amazement that the boss had asked for a second plate of food at supper. By the sixth evening, Vance had turned his head to look at the window when she entered rather than continuing to stare at the ceiling, which represented, in the context of his general immobility, something close to a greeting. By the eighth evening, he spoke. She was midway through a passage she particularly loved, a scene of tremendous emotional complexity in which Bathsheba was wrestling with consequences of her own making, and she was reading it with the full attention it deserved, her voice quiet and steady in the way that reading aloud requires, when he said, "She is going to make the wrong choice again." Zelda stopped. She looked up from the page. He was looking at the ceiling, but she could see from the way he held himself that he was listening and had been listening, genuinely, for longer than she had realized. "She is," Zelda agreed carefully, "but she will learn from it." "People who keep making the same wrong choice do not generally learn from it," he said. His voice was rusty from disuse, like a hinge that has been still too long. "Hardy believes she will," Zelda said, "and I believe Hardy." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was the shape a smile might make in a face that had forgotten the gesture. "You trust the book," he said. "I trust this one," she replied. He did not say anything else for the rest of that evening, but when she closed the book at the chapter's end, he turned his head and looked at her directly for the first time. Not the assessing stranger's glance from the general store, but something different. Something that held a question he was not ready to ask, and possibly a recognition he was not ready to name. She said good night and she left, and she spent entirely too much of the ride back to town thinking about the color of his eyes. The next evening she arrived to find that someone had moved the chair. It was no longer against the wall. It had been positioned closer to the bed, angled slightly toward the window, with a small oil lamp on the table beside it that had not been there before. Someone had made these adjustments deliberately. The someone in question was lying in the bed looking at the ceiling with an expression of absolute neutrality that did not fool her for a second. "Someone moved the chair," she said. "Gideon must have done it," Vance said, in the tone of a man offering an explanation he does not expect to be believed. "Of course," she said, and sat down in the repositioned chair and opened the book, and did not allow herself to smile until she was looking at the page. They read for an hour that night, and this time twice more he commented. Once on the character of Gabriel Oak, whom he assessed with a directness that surprised her, calling him a man who has learned to love without demanding to be loved back in kind, and saying this with a quietness that made her feel she was hearing something he had not meant to say quite so plainly. And once on the landscape of the novel, the moors and the farms, saying that he had read descriptions of the English countryside and always found them too soft, too managed, nothing like the land he knew, and she said without thinking, "What is the land you know like?" And he was quiet for a moment before saying, "Like something that will never quite belong to you, no matter how long you work it, like it's only lending itself to you for a while." She wrote that down in her journal that night. She did not know why, except that it felt true in a way that deserved to be preserved. On the 10th evening, Dr. Carver came by while she was reading and stopped in the doorway with his bag in his hand and an expression of complete bafflement on his face. He had not expected to find his patient propped against the headboard rather than lying flat, his color improved, his eyes alert, engaged in what appeared to be a spirited if one-sided literary argument with the young woman reading to him. "Well," the doctor said. Vance looked at him with the cool self-containment that was apparently his default when someone interrupted something he had not known he was enjoying. "Evening, Carver. How are the ribs healing? Shoulder? Stiff, but better. The doctor examined him, asked his questions, pressed carefully at the stitches which were holding cleanly, and then stood back with his arms folded and the look of a man revising his prognosis upward by several weeks. "You are healing faster than I would have expected," Carver said. "I am aware," Vance said, with a tone that very deliberately did not look at Zelda. She, equally deliberately, studied the page she was holding as though it contained information of urgent personal importance. The doctor left, and in the silence after his footsteps receded, Vance said, "You can start at the top of page 112 where you left off." "I know where I left off," she said. "Then read," he said, and she read. It was after the 12th evening that things began to shift in a way that both of them were aware of, and neither was quite ready to address. She had begun arriving earlier, not by plan, but by the way one's feet developed their own opinion about a direction, and she and Vance had taken to talking in the 20 minutes before she opened the book. Talking about small things at first, what had happened in town that day, how the weather was turning, a particularly interesting thing Aunt Rosalie had said at breakfast, then larger things. He asked her why she had come west, and she told him about Rosalie and the boarding house and the practical necessity of a change. And she did not mention Edmund because Edmund was not a story she was ready to tell to anyone, let alone to this man whose opinion, she was aware, had begun to matter to her in a way she was treating with extreme caution. He told her about the doubleback, how he had come to New Mexico 11 years ago at 19 with $50, and a horse that was not entirely his and a conviction that the land could be made to yield something worthwhile if you were willing to stay and fight for it. How he had built the herd up from 30 cattle to 300 and was working toward 500. How the stampede had started with a rattlesnake and a moment of bad luck and had nearly ended 11 years of work in about 40 seconds. "Were you afraid?" she asked, and immediately wondered if that was too direct. He was quiet for a moment. "I thought about the herd," he said. "While it was happening, I thought about the cattle, whether they would scatter south toward the canyon or turn east toward the road. Not about yourself." "There was not time to think about myself." He paused. "After, when I was on the ground and Gideon was yelling from somewhere I could not see, then yes. Then I was afraid." She held that information carefully, the way you hold something fragile that has been handed to you unexpectedly. "That is honest," she said. "I try to be," he said. And here is where she made her small, critical mistake, or what felt like a mistake in the moment, because she said, without quite thinking it through, "I have not met many men who are honest, actually." And then she heard what she had said and felt the color come into her face. He looked at her, really looked at her, with the kind of attention he usually paid to problems that needed solving. "Someone was dishonest with you," he said. "It was not quite a question." "It is not important," she said, opening the book with more purpose than was strictly necessary. "You do not have to tell me," he said, "but you do not have to pretend it did not happen either." She looked up from the book. The lamp between them cast everything in warm, specific light, and the sounds of the ranch in the evening were coming through the cracked window, the low sound of cattle and the distant voice of one of the hands singing something that was more honest than musical. "I was engaged," she said. "For 2 years. His name was Edmund, and he was a lawyer in Cincinnati, and he was very good at appearing to be exactly what he was not." She paused. "He was engaged to another woman simultaneously for the entire duration of our engagement. I found out through a letter that was delivered to me by mistake. It was addressed to her, and it was from him, and it was very affectionate." Vance's expression did not change dramatically, but something in it settled into a kind of steady, contained anger that she recognized as the kind that burns clean rather than violent. "That is a serious betrayal," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It was. And you came out here because of it." "I came out here because Rosalie needed help," she said. "Edmund was the reason I was available to come." "There is a difference," he acknowledged. "Yes," she said again. "There is." She read for the rest of the evening, and they did not speak of Edmund again that night. But when she left and he said good night, there was something in his voice that had not been there before, a warmth that was careful with itself but present nonetheless. And she felt it follow her all the way down the hallway and out into the cool September night. The following days brought a particular kind of autumn to the New Mexico territory that was not cold exactly, but that had a clarity to it, a sharpness at the edges of everything, as though the season were concentrating itself. Zelda drove herself out to the doubleback in a borrowed buggy now, because Gideon had offered, and she had accepted on the grounds that practicality made more sense than ceremony. The hands at the ranch had begun to treat her arrival as a fixed point in the day's schedule, the way they treated the evening meal and the last check of the herd. Vance's recovery continued to proceed at a rate that surprised Dr. Carver each time he visited. The ribs were knitting ahead of schedule. The shoulder had regained a significant portion of its range of motion. The wound along his side had closed cleanly, leaving a scar that would be permanent but was healing without complication. Carver told Zelda privately, catching her in the hallway one evening with his bag over his arm and a look of genuine professional puzzlement, that he attributed some portion of the physical improvement to the simple fact of a reduced state of agitation. "A wounded man who fights against being still," Carver said, "does himself tremendous damage. Your presence seems to have persuaded him to accept the stillness." He paused. "I do not entirely know how you managed that." "Hardy managed it," she said. Carver gave her a look that said he was choosing not to argue with her assessment. She knew the real answer was more complex than that, and it had less to do with the novel than with what had begun to happen in the space between the readings. Vance had begun to do something she had not anticipated. He had begun to anticipate her. Not in an obvious or demanding way, not in any way that was openly declared, but in the small, accumulating evidence of a man whose attention had reorganized itself around a specific gravity. He would have questions ready for her when she arrived, things he had been thinking about since the previous evening that he wanted to discuss. Not just about the novel, though those conversations continued and were genuinely wonderful, both of them engaged and sometimes disagreeing sharply and arguing back and forth about character and motivation, and the choices Hardy made on the page with an honesty that felt almost unprecedented in Zelda's experience of conversation with another person. But also questions about her. Careful, considered questions that revealed that he had been paying attention to everything she said and was interested in more of it. He asked about the books she had read, and she told him, and he listened with the focus of someone who has not had much access to books and has consequently developed an enormous respect for the people who have. He had attended school until he was 14, he told her, when his father's illness had ended that particular chapter, and he had read when he could after that, but ranching left little time for sustained reading, and so he had come to think of it as something other people did, people with more leisure and less land. "You have missed a great deal," she told him, meaning it kindly. "I know it," he said. "Tell me what." So she told him. She talked about the novels she loved and why, not just the plots but what they were attempting, what they said about being human in a world that did not particularly accommodate human feelings. She talked about Jane Austen, whose controlled wit she admired enormously, and Dickens, whose sentimentality sometimes overwhelmed her but whose social conscience she found indispensable, and she talked about George Eliot with a particular passion that made Vance ask, "You feel strongly about that one?" George Eliot understood how trapped people can be by what others expect of them, Zelda said. She understood the difference between the life you are handed and the life you manage to make. She understood that those two things are often very far apart. Vance was quiet for a moment. "You feel trapped," he said. "I felt trapped," she corrected. "I came west." "You said that before," he said, "but coming west is not the same as feeling free." She looked at him for a long moment and was surprised by the precision of this. "No," she said, "it is not, but it is closer." On the 14th evening, which would later feel to both of them like a kind of threshold, the evening began as the others had, but then took a turn neither of them planned for. She had arrived to find him sitting up fully for the first time, having apparently decided unilaterally that he was done with the horizontal, despite the doctor's instructions. He was dressed, sort of, in trousers and a loose shirt that was open at the collar because he could not manage the buttons himself with his shoulder still limited, and he was in the chair rather than the bed. "Dr. Carver did not clear you to sit up fully," she said. "Dr. Carver is not here," Vance said. "I can see that," she replied. "I have been horizontal for 2 weeks and I am done with it," he said, with the flat finality of a man who has been patient as long as his nature permits and has now arrived at the absolute outer limit of that patience. She considered arguing, and then decided against it on the grounds that this particular argument had already been decided. She pulled the chair to its customary position and sat down and opened the book. They read for a while, and it was good. The way their evenings had become good, layered and warm and comfortable in the particular way of two people who have discovered that they can share silence as well as words without either becoming restless. Then she reached a passage that she loved very much, one of Gabriel Oak's quiet declarations, not the theatrical kind but the kind that is bone deep and unconditional. And she read it carefully, giving it the weight it deserved, and when she finished the paragraph she looked up and found that Vance was looking at her. Not at the window, not at the ceiling, at her. And the way he was looking at her was not the way he had looked at her that first evening in the doorway, not the wounded fury of a man cornered in his own vulnerability. It was entirely different. It was the way someone looks at something they have been trying not to want, having given up trying. "Zelda," he said. His voice when he said her name was different from how it usually was. She had noted that he very rarely used her name, addressing her as he addressed most things, obliquely by implication. When he did use it, it landed differently. "Yes," she said. "I want to say something and I would like you to let me finish before you respond." "All right," she said, closing the book on her finger to keep the page. He was quiet for a moment, gathering the words the way someone gathers things that are scattered and important and must be collected carefully. "I was not glad you came that first evening," he said. "I want to be honest about that, because I think honesty is the only useful currency between people. I was not glad. I was angry and I was humiliated and I wanted you to leave. I thought you were there because of Gideon's sentiment and Rosalie's good intentions, and that it would be temporary and irritating and eventually end." "I know," she said. "Let me finish," he said. "Sorry," she said. "I was wrong about what it would be," he said. "I have been wrong about a significant number of things in the past 2 weeks, including how long it was going to take me to admit that I look forward to these evenings more than I have looked forward to anything in longer than I can easily calculate." He paused. "I am telling you this because you have been honest with me, and you deserve the same in return. I am not asking you for anything. I understand that you have had a specific and serious experience of what it means when a man says things he does not mean. I am not asking you to do anything with what I am saying except to know it. The lamp between them was very steady. There was no wind through the window to disturb the flame, and the evening outside was going quietly dark, and she could hear the cattle a long way off and closer, somewhere, a horse shifting its weight. "Vance," she said. "You do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "I am going to say something anyway," she said. He waited. "I came out here 3 months ago, and I thought that I was done with the particular kind of hoping that gets attached to a specific person," she said. "I thought that was finished in me, the capacity for it. I thought Edmund had taken it with him when I found out who he actually was." She paused, watching the lamp flame not because it was interesting but because looking at him directly for this part was more than she could manage. "I was wrong about that as well." The silence after this was not empty. It was the kind of silence that is full of something that has just been named and is now real in a way it was not before. "I am still going to need you to be cautious with me," she said. "I know that is asking a great deal." "I have 11 years of building something one day at a time," he said. "I understand cautious." She looked up at him then, and he was looking at her with an expression that was open in a way she had not seen from him before. That wall she had noted on the very first evening entirely absent, and she felt something in her chest, do something complicated and warm and frightening and right. "Read me the rest of the chapter," he said. She opened the book to where her finger held the page. Her hands were entirely steady, which surprised her. She began to read, and his face in the lamplight was the most attentive audience she had ever had. And she thought that she would remember this evening, specifically this one, for the rest of her life regardless of what came after. 3 days later, Vance walked out of the bedroom for the first time under his own power, moving carefully because the ribs still protested sudden movements, one hand against the wall for the first 50 feet, and then without it for the rest of the hallway and into the kitchen, where Gideon was at the table drinking coffee and looked up with an expression of such complete relief that it was almost painful to witness. "Boss," Gideon said, setting down the cup. "Morning," Vance said, and lowered himself into a chair at the table with the deliberate economy of a man managing pain with dignity. He ate breakfast and Zelda was not there. She came in the evenings, but the fact of her was present in the room in some atmospheric way, the way a lamp is present in a room even after it has been put out, in the warmth that remains. Gideon, who was not a man for speeches, said only, "She reads well." Vance poured himself coffee. "She reads very well," he agreed. Dr. Carver came that afternoon, assessed Vance with increasing surprise and satisfaction, and declared that if he continued at this rate the ribs should be considered healed within another 10 days, and the shoulder already had more mobility than it had any right to. He recommended continued rest but acknowledged, with the pragmatism of a frontier doctor who knows when to negotiate with reality, that what constituted rest for a cattleman was different from what it constituted for other men. "Light work only," Carver said. "No riding for another week." 2 days, Vance said. 1 week, Carver said firmly. 4 days. 5, Carver said, apparently deciding that some compromise was achievable. Vance accepted this. When Zelda arrived that evening, she found him not in the bedroom but in the main room of the house, in the large wooden chair by the fireplace, where an autumn fire was laid and burning low. He stood when she came in, which cost him something physically. She could see it in the slight, careful quality of the movement, but he stood. "You are out of bed," she said. "I am," he confirmed. "How do the ribs feel?" "Like ribs that have been broken and are healing," he said. "Which is to say, specific and constant but manageable." She looked around the main room, which was a space she had only passed through on her way to the sick room. It was a working room, not a decorative one, with the practical, slightly spare quality of a house that has been built and furnished by a man who knows what he needs and is clear about the difference between need and ornament. But there were things in it that interested her. A shelf along one wall with perhaps 20 books on it, a collection that was clearly the result of deliberate choice over many years rather than casual accumulation. A map of the territory pinned to the wall beside the window with notations on it in an angular, precise handwriting. A set of drawings on the table that she realized after a moment were plans for a barn expansion. "You drew these?" she asked, looking at the plans. "The barn needs extending before next spring," he said, coming to stand beside her at the table, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him. "We are going to have 300 head of young cattle coming through and nowhere adequate to house them through any bad weather." She looked at the drawings with genuine interest. They were precise and thoughtful, the geometry clean, the annotations clear. "You are an architect of sorts," she said. "I am a man who needs more barn and cannot afford the luxury of not knowing how to plan one," he said. She smiled. "That is not a contradiction of what I said." He looked at her smile in the way he sometimes looked at things that unexpectedly pleased him, which was with a quality of attention that was unguarded for exactly the duration of the pleasure, and then carefully settled back into composure. "Sit down," he said. I had Gideon move the chairs. He had, in fact, arranged the chairs by the fire with the small table and the lamp between them, which was so precisely the configuration of the sickroom evenings that she felt a rush of something warm and recognizing. "We are continuing the reading out here, then," she said, settling into the chair. "Unless you have objections," he said, lowering himself into the other with that careful economy of motion. "No objections," she said. She read that evening until the fire had burned down to coals, and the lamp needed trimming, and the ranch outside had gone entirely quiet. It was the longest reading session they had had, and they talked more than usual, the conversation weaving in and out of the novel in the way it had begun to do naturally. Hardy's characters becoming a kind of shared vocabulary for things that were harder to say directly. She noted that Vance, when he wanted to say something about himself that felt too exposed to say plainly, sometimes said it through the characters, offering an observation about Oak or Bathsheba that was clearly doing double work. She did the same thing herself, and was not entirely comfortable with how transparent this probably was. When she stood to leave, pulling on her coat and gathering the book, he stood as well and walked with her to the door, which was the first time he had done this. At the door she turned, and they were closer than they had been in the evenings by the sixth, close enough that she could see the individual details of his face in the lamplight falling from inside, the line of his jaw, the scar above his left eyebrow that she had noticed before and not asked about, the quality in his eyes that was simultaneously steady and searching. "Same time tomorrow," she said. "I will be here," he said. She went down the porch steps and he stood in the doorway and watched her go to the buggy, and she was aware of being watched the entire way and was aware that she did not mind it. Not remotely. The week that followed was one she would describe later, to Rosalie, who listened with the particular attentive satisfaction of someone who has been hoping for exactly this outcome, as the most interesting week of her life to that point. Vance began to move around the ranch again, slowly and with the caution of someone respecting the terms of his negotiation with Dr. Carver. And she began to arrive earlier because the evenings felt too short, and she had found that being at the Doubleback had a quality that Las Cruces itself did not, which was the quality of being exactly where she was supposed to be, which was something she had not felt in a long time. He showed her the ranch. Not formally, not with the manner of someone giving a tour, but incidentally, in the way that happens when two people are both going somewhere, and the going becomes more important than the destination. He showed her the cattle, the herd working its way across the autumn grassland, and explained the characteristics of different animals with a specificity and affection that delighted her, because it was so precisely the opposite of how he spoke about most things that it revealed the depth of his investment. He showed her the barn, the current one and the planned extension he had drawn, and explained the structural thinking behind the drawings, and she asked questions that he answered with increasing pleasure, the way someone answers questions from a person who is genuinely listening. He showed her the view from the ridge at the east edge of the property, where the land folded down toward the valley, and the mountains stood behind everything like a permanent fact. And they stood there in the cool morning light, and she thought of what he had said about the land lending itself to you for a while, and she thought that she understood it better from up here, the scale of the negotiation between a person and a place this enormous. "I love it," she said simply, meaning the view and also meaning in some way she was not quite ready to say directly, rather more than that. He looked at her. "It suits you," he said. "This place." She looked at him. "You say that as though you have been thinking about it." "I have been thinking about a number of things," he said, which was as close to a direct declaration as anything he had said outside the sick room, and she felt it land precisely. They were not riding. He was not cleared for riding yet, and she was not a particularly accomplished rider in any case, though she was learning. One of the hands named Rogelio having appointed himself her informal teacher with the cheerful patience of someone who genuinely loves horses and wants others to share this love. They were standing on the ridge, and the wind was doing something thoughtful with the grasses below them, and she was warm inside her coat and very aware that his shoulder was an inch from hers. She turned slightly, and so did he, and they were facing each other. And the question that had been building across evenings and conversations, and the particular intimacy of shared books and lamplight, was suddenly present and unanswerable. He lifted his right hand and touched her face, very carefully, the way you touch something that matters, and she put her hand over his, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because the moment did not require language. It only required the willingness to be in it. He kissed her. It was not the first kiss of two strangers. It was the first kiss of two people who had spent weeks becoming extraordinarily familiar with each other across a distance. They had both maintained carefully, and the closing of that distance had the quality of something inevitable that has finally arrived. It was gentle, because he was someone who understood that being direct did not mean being careless, and she kissed him back with the full honesty of someone who had decided a long time ago that she would not be smaller than herself for anyone. When they separated, he kept his hand on her face for a moment, and she kept her hand over his, and the mountains stood behind them, and the cattle moved in the valley below, and the sky was the particular, enormous blue of a New Mexico morning that seems to have more sky in it than is strictly necessary. "I should probably tell you," he said, "that I have not done this in a considerable amount of time." "Kiss someone," she said. "Been interested enough to try," he said. She looked at him steadily. "How long is a considerable amount of time?" "Since before I built the barn," he said, which she realized after a moment was his way of contextualizing it within the architecture of the ranch, which apparently was his reference system for time. "That is quite a while," she said. "I was busy," he said, with the tone of a man being wry about something that is also genuinely true. "You are less busy now," she observed. "I am temporarily incapacitated," he corrected, "which is different, which is significantly different," he agreed, "and has provided me with a considerable amount of time to think about things I would normally be too busy to think about." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the valley. Are you going to be busy again when you are healed? He understood the question. She could see that he understood it. I am going to be busy and I am also going to make time, he said. Those are not the same problem. No, she agreed. They are not. He took her hand, which was the first time he had done that, and held it with the same careful, deliberate quality with which he did everything. And they stood on the ridge for a while longer before walking back down to the ranch. Rosalie received the news of this development with the satisfaction of a woman who has been right about something important and knows it. She hugged Zelda firmly and then held her at arm's length and looked at her face and said, "You look different." "Do I?" Zelda said. "Like someone who is not carrying everything by themselves anymore," Rosalie said. "It suits you." The weeks that followed were, in the vocabulary of that autumn, extraordinary. Vance's recovery reached completion on a specific afternoon when Dr. Carver examined him and declared him sufficiently healed to return to full duties, adding with a dry clinical understatement that he was not sure he had ever revised a prognosis quite so dramatically upward in quite such a short time. "What changed?" Carver asked, though his tone suggested he already had a theory. "Attitude," Vance said. Said Carver. The evenings with Zelda did not end when Vance was healed, because ending them was something neither of them had any intention of doing. They finished far from the madding crowd on an evening in late October, reaching the last pages together, Zelda reading and Vance listening from the chair across the fire. And when she read the final paragraph and closed the book, there was a specific kind of quiet that follows the end of a story that has been good enough to matter. "Well," Vance said. "Well," she agreed. "Oak got what he deserved," he said. "He was patient," she said. "He knew what he wanted," Vance said. She set the book on her knee and looked at him across the fire. "What do you want, Vance?" He met her eyes with the directness that she had come to know as entirely characteristic of him, the willingness to look at things straight on even when looking sideways would be easier. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not just the evenings. I want to know if there is a possibility of something permanent. I am asking that plainly because I think you deserve plain speaking and because I am not a man who does things by half." He paused. "I understand if that is too much or too soon. I want you to have whatever time you need. But I want you to know what I am hoping for." She was quiet long enough that the fire settled and a log shifted and sent up a brief bright constellation of sparks. "Rosalie needs me at the boarding house," she said. "I know," he said. "And I am not someone who abandons a commitment because something more convenient presents itself," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I am not asking you to." She looked at him. "I am not saying no," she said carefully. "I am saying I need to think about what yes means practically. What it requires of me and what it would mean for the people I am responsible to." "That is fair," he said. "I will tell you this," she said. "The thing I am most afraid of is not the practical questions. The practical questions have answers and I am good at finding answers." She paused. "What I am afraid of is the thing I told you about with Edmund. The hidden motive, the secret life running alongside the visible one. I am afraid of giving myself to something that turns out to be built on a false foundation." He leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with the full force of the steadiness that was one of the things she had come to love best about him, that rock-certain quality of a man whose character is not performed but structural. "I have no secrets from you," he said. "I have not been perfectly good throughout my life, and I have made specific mistakes, and if you want to know any of them, you can ask me and I will tell you. But there is no hidden version of me that you do not have access to. There is no other person. There is the ranch and the work and now there is you, and those things do not contradict each other." She looked at him for a long time. "I believe you," she said. "Good," he said quietly. "I need 3 weeks," she said, "to talk to Rosalie and to think and to make sure that what I want and what is right are pointing in the same direction." "You have 3 weeks," he said. "You have as many weeks as you need." She went home that night and lay awake for a long time looking at the ceiling of her room at Rosalie's boarding house. And the ceiling told her nothing useful, which she had expected. And by morning, she knew that the 3 weeks had been a formality, that the thinking was something she needed to do rather than something that would change the outcome. She talked to Rosalie, who was practical and sensible, and loving in approximately that order. Rosalie said that she had been managing the boarding house before Zelda arrived and would manage it after, and that the school had recently engaged a new teacher who was looking for supplementary work, and that while she would miss Zelda's company deeply, she would not be the reason her niece turned away from something good out of obligation. "Your mother would have liked him," Rosalie said, which was the highest endorsement she had available. Zelda rode out to the doubleback on the morning of the 3rd day, not the 21st but the 3rd, because the 3 weeks had been about being honest with herself, and she had been honest with herself in approximately 72 hours. Vance was at the fence near the barn when she drove up, working at something with a post-hole digger, which meant the shoulder was fully functional again, and he was making up for lost time in the usual way of people who have been forcibly still for too long. He straightened when he heard the buggy and watched her drive up with the expression of someone who is trying not to look like they have been counting days. She climbed down from the buggy and walked up to him and said, "It has only been 3 days. "I am aware," he said carefully. "I told you 3 weeks because I thought I needed 3 weeks," she said. "It turns out I needed less time than that." He set the post-hole digger against the fence. And yes," she said, "to the thing you were hoping for." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, and when he took her hands in his they were rough from the morning's work and completely warm, and she felt the ground under her feet as something solid and real and hers. "Yes," he said, as though saying it himself made it more true. "Yes," she confirmed. He kissed her in the morning sunlight in the middle of the yard with the cattle in the distance, and the mountains behind everything and Gideon somewhere on the other side of the barn, almost certainly aware of the situation, and choosing very wisely to remain on the other side of the barn. Gideon stood as Vance's witness. Rosalie stood as Zelda's. The school teacher from the boarding house, whose name was Prudence and who had become a friend, wept steadily throughout the ceremony with the enthusiastic tears of someone who experiences other people's happiness as a personal gift. The minister, a man named Reverend Claxton who had known Vance for 7 years and had apparently given up expecting this day, delivered the ceremony with the barely suppressed satisfaction of someone whose faith in eventual outcomes has been vindicated. When Vance said the words, he said them in the same voice he used when he was saying something that was absolutely true and would be absolutely true tomorrow and the day after that, steady and without decoration. And she thought, this is what honesty sounds like when it is also love. She said her words with the full force of someone who has been careful for a long time and is now choosing to be exactly as open as the moment requires. They went back to the doubleback, which was now hers as well, on the afternoon of the wedding in a wagon that Gideon had decorated with the kind of cheerful exuberance that suggested he had been waiting to do this since approximately October and had been putting considerable creative energy into the anticipation. The house felt different to her as a home than it had as a place she visited. Not because anything in it had changed, but because her relationship to it had. And she spent the first week cataloging its qualities the way she had once cataloged new books, discovering what it contained and what it was, and what it might become. The main room, the kitchen, the bedroom that was now theirs, the view from the east window in the morning when the mountains caught the light, the sounds of the ranch at night, which she had always thought would keep her awake, but which had instead, from the very first night, become the sounds that told her she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She brought her books and installed them on the shelf alongside his, and the combined collection was more than either had expected, 20 of his and 14 of hers making a row that seemed, somehow, like a statement. "We will need a bigger shelf," he said, looking at it. "Eventually," she agreed, thinking of the books she intended to order from Santa Fe over the coming months, and also, though she did not say this yet, thinking of other things that might eventually require more space. The ranch in the winter was different from the ranch in the autumn, more demanding in certain ways and quieter in others, and she learned its rhythms with the same thoroughness she brought to everything she cared about. She helped with the accounts, which Vance had been managing in a way that worked, but that she saw could be made significantly more efficient. And she took this over with his full and relieved cooperation within the first month. She taught herself to ride properly, progressing under Rogelio's instruction from competent to genuinely good, which pleased Vance in a way he expressed through the particular quality of his attention when he watched her in the saddle, which was appreciation stripped of any attempt to seem less than impressed. She read to him in the evening still. They had finished Hardy and moved on to other books, and the evenings by the fire were something she thought of as the heartwood of their life together, the central, essential thing around which everything else was arranged. He had become a committed and opinionated reader himself, engaging with the books in a way that made her wonder what he might have been if the life circumstances had been different, and then setting aside that speculation, because what he was extraordinary, and speculation about alternative paths was a way of undervaluing what the actual path had produced. They argued sometimes, not about anything fundamental, not about anything that drew on the dark past of betrayal or the specific wounds that each of them carried from before this life. They argued about practical things. How many head of cattle to purchase in the spring, whether the roof of the barn extension needed to be steeper than his plans indicated, whether Dickens was as essential as she maintained or merely occasionally excellent as he contended. These arguments were, she discovered, one of the genuinely great pleasures of being with a person who has strong opinions and respects yours enough to engage with them seriously. In March of 1882, which was to say 3 months after the wedding, she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the morning, in the kitchen, over coffee, because this was where they had most of their real conversations, the kitchen in the morning being their specific domestic version of the evenings by the fire, a regular safe place for things that mattered. He was quiet for a moment that she did not know how to read. Then he said, "Are you certain? Dr. Carver confirmed it yesterday," she said. Another moment. Then he stood up from the table and came to where she was standing and held her with the careful, whole-body attention of someone for whom touching the person they love is always deliberate and never casual. And she felt the quality of the moment in his arms, the emotion he did not put into words because the words were insufficient, and he knew it. "I did not know I wanted this," he said into her hair. "Until just now I would have said I had not thought about it, but that is apparently not true." "No," she agreed, her face against his shoulder. "A child," he said, "just that, processing it. Sometime in autumn," she said. He pulled back enough to look at her face, and what was on his was the most unguarded expression she had ever seen from him, which given the progress of the past months was a substantial claim. "You are well?" he asked. "Carver said you are well." "He said I am very healthy and have an excellent constitution," she said. "Good," he said, with the fierce, quiet satisfaction of someone for whom the health of this specific person is non-negotiable, The spring and summer of 1882 were extraordinary in their fullness. The ranch expanded. The barn extension was completed according to Vance's plans with a roof that was, Zelda was pleased to note, somewhat steeper than the original design, she having made a persuasive structural argument that he had eventually conceded was sound. The cattle numbers increased to 380, heading toward 500 with a momentum that made Gideon walk around with the quietly satisfied expression of a man watching a long bet finally paying out. Zelda's pregnancy progressed healthily and visibly, and she did not let it slow her down in any way that was not strictly medically indicated, which was a position she held firmly, and that Vance respected, while simultaneously watching her with the vigilant concern of someone for whom caution on her behalf was a permanent and non-negotiable state. She ordered books from Santa Fe, which arrived in quantities that made the mail delivery an event on the ranch. He began to read independently, something she had encouraged from the beginning, and she would come in from morning tasks to find him in the chair by the fire with a book, which never failed to do something specifically warm to her chest. They rode together most evenings when the weather allowed, out to the East Ridge sometimes, or along the perimeter of the property where the land shifted from managed range to the wilder country beyond. And she came to know the doubleback the way you know a person you love, not just its outlines but its specific character, its moods, its beauty in different lights. She wrote letters to her mother and her brothers in Ohio, long and honest letters that did not minimize the challenges of frontier life, but were full of the specific, credible happiness of someone for whom the challenges were balanced by something that made them worthwhile. Her brother James wrote back at length, with both the warmth she had hoped for and the concern of a man who has sisters and takes the responsibility seriously, asking specific questions about Vance that she answered with the precision of someone who knows the subject thoroughly. Vance wrote to James as well, which was not something she had asked him to do, and which she discovered only when James mentioned it in a subsequent letter. She asked Vance about it, and he said that James was her family and her family's opinion of him mattered, and that he had nothing to hide and preferred to be known rather than to have people drawing conclusions from incomplete information. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "I told him what I do and what my intentions are and what my character is to the best of my honest self-assessment," Vance said. "And what is your character, to the best of your honest self-assessment?" She said, with the specific teasing quality she deployed when she wanted to see how he handled being asked to be sincere. He looked at her with the expression that meant he was declining to rise to the teasing while also engaging with the substance beneath it. "Patient," he said. "Within limits. Honest. Seriously committed to the things I take seriously, which are few but absolute." He paused. "Better than I was before October of last year, I think, though that is possibly not the most rigorous control case." She crossed the room and sat beside him and put her hand on his arm and said, "James will like you." "I am not asking him to like me," Vance said. "I am asking him to believe me." "That is the same thing for James," she said. The baby arrived in October, which was exactly a year after the evenings of reading had begun, a fact she noted with the private, happy precision of someone who notices the shape of time. He was born on a cold, clear morning, attended by Dr. Carver and a midwife named Mrs. Alcott, who had delivered approximately 400 babies in the territory, and approached the situation with the calm expertise of someone to whom this is routine and important in equal measure. The baby was a boy, which was not a surprise to either of them, though they had spoken of both possibilities equally, and he was healthy and loud and had, Zelda noted with great affection, the particular quality of being completely certain of his right to be present and heard, which she suspected was a brute characteristic. Vance held him in the first minutes with the absolute focused attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, looking at his son with the expression of a man for whom something entirely new and irrevocable has just happened, something wonderful and beyond the vocabulary of his usual self-expression. "He is furious about being here," Vance observed as the baby demonstrated his lungs. "He will settle," Zelda said from the bed, watching him. "He gets the stubbornness from my side," Vance said. "He gets the volume from yours as well then, because I am actually quite quiet," she said. Vance looked up from the baby at her, and the expression on his face was the one she loved best, the one that was entirely unguarded and had the quality of the man behind all the careful walls, the one she had glimpsed first in the sickroom lamplight and had never lost sight of since. "You are not quiet," he said. "You are precise." "That is very generous," she said. "It is accurate," he said. They named him Thomas, for Thomas Hardy, which was a private joke and a genuine tribute in equal measure, and which Gideon received when informed with a blank look followed by a slow nod, and then an expression that said he was choosing not to ask questions about this. Thomas Prout was, in the assessment of everyone on the doubleback, an excellent baby after the first 3 weeks during which he was a challenging one. He settled into himself and into the household with the confidence of someone who has assessed the situation and found it adequate, and the ranch, which had been organized around cattle and work and the necessary business of frontier life, reorganized itself around him in the way that children reorganize everything, completely and without negotiation. Rosalie came to visit in November and held Thomas for an entire afternoon, and cried twice, and told Zelda that she was magnificent, which was the word Rosalie reserved for genuinely exceptional occasions. James came the following spring, all the way from Cincinnati, which required planning and expense and significant commitment, and he arrived with the wary assessment of a protective older brother, and departed with the firm approval of a man who has been surprised into respect. He and Vance had spent 2 days at the ranch, during which they had ridden the property and discussed cattle and the economics of land ownership in the territory. And Zelda suspected, based on the quality of silence at certain points, a number of more personal things that neither of them reported to her in detail. "He is a good man," James told her the morning he left. "I know that," she said. "He looks at you like you are something he cannot believe is real," James said, with the awkward sincerity of a man who has not said a romantic thing in years and is trying. "He tells me things directly instead," she said. "It is better." James conceded this with a nod. The ranch grew. The cattle numbers reached 420 in the second year of their marriage, and Vance hired 2 additional hands and began to talk seriously about expanding the range to the east, land that was currently unclaimed but would not remain so as the territory continued to develop. He made a trip to the land office in Santa Fe that took a week, during which Zelda managed the ranch accounts and the household, and Thomas with the complete competence of someone who has never required supervision and has simply been waiting for the scope of her responsibility to expand to match her capacity. When Vance came back from Santa Fe, he came back with the additional land claim and a parcel of books she had asked him to look for on her behalf at the bookshop in the city, which he had found and purchased with the particular care of someone who has taken the list very seriously. "You got everything on the list," she said, looking through the parcel. "I got everything on the list and 2 additional ones the bookseller recommended when I described what you read," he said. "You described what I read to a bookseller." "He was helpful," Vance said, with the look of a man who has discovered an unexpected useful resource and is not embarrassed about having engaged with it. She kissed him for the books, which was something he received with entirely characteristic directness, and no complaint. The evenings by the fire continued through all of this, through Thomas growing from an infant who slept through the readings to a toddler who sat between them on the sofa and listened with his serious, dark eyes to the words he was too young to understand, but seemed to find soothing in the way that all young children find the sound of their parents' voices, and through the slow, accumulating ordinary, extraordinary life of two people who have built something real together. She read. He listened and contributed and argued and asked questions. Sometimes he read to her, which had started as a reversal. She proposed one evening when her voice was tired, and which he had approached with the initial reluctance of someone uncertain of their performance, and then the growing confidence of someone discovering they are capable of something new. He read carefully and without performance, but with a depth of attention that made even familiar passages feel discovered. She lay on the sofa with her feet near the fire, and listened and thought that this was happiness in its precise form, not the dramatized happiness of romantic expectation, but the actual kind, warm and specific and completely present. 2 years after Thomas was born, Zelda told him she was pregnant again. He received this news with significantly more ease than the first time, which she noted. "You are less surprised," she said. "I am delighted," he corrected. "Less surprised, yes. The first time you had to show me an entirely new horizon. The second time I can see where the horizon is." "That is very philosophical for breakfast," she said. "It is excellent coffee," he said. The second child was also a boy, arriving in the spring of 1885, which was a particularly good spring at the Doubleback, the grass strong after winter rain and the herd healthy, and the barn extension having more than proven its worth across 3 winters. They named the second boy Henry, for no literary reason, but because it was a name that Vance said felt solid, which was the highest praise available to him for a name or indeed for most things. Henry Prout was different from Thomas in every way that siblings are different, which is to say fundamentally, deeply, in ways that reveal the total independence of two people from the same origin. He was quieter and more watchful, and from the earliest age he had an affinity for the horses that Rogelio noted with professional approval, and that Vance observed with the particular satisfaction of a man watching the inheritance of something he values. Thomas, who was 2 when Henry arrived and therefore in the position of the dethroned only child, managed this transition with the mixed emotional complexity of his age, requiring significant reassurance over the first months, and then apparently deciding that having a brother was acceptable on the grounds that Henry was small and easily impressed and could be shown things. Zelda watched her sons with the full attention she had always given to things that mattered, the same quality of observation she had brought to books and to the ranch and to the man she loved, and she found in them the daily and inexhaustible evidence of something she had not known she was hoping for until she had it. Her books filled the shelf and overflowed onto a second shelf that Vance built at her request, and the second shelf filled too, and eventually he built her a small bookcase of her own in the corner of the main room that became one of the defining features of the space, along with the fire and the 2 chairs, and the table with the lamp between them. She thought sometimes, in the way that happiness sometimes turns slightly philosophical, about the path that had brought her here, about Edmund and the letter delivered by mistake, and the specific kind of devastation that had made Ohio impossible and the West necessary. She did not think about Edmund with pain any longer, and had not for some time. She thought about him with the distant, dispassionate clarity of someone looking at a thing that is far away and no longer has any relevance to where they are standing. She was grateful, in a complicated way, that the betrayal had happened. Not because it was just or deserved, because it was neither. But because without it, she would not have come west. And without coming west, she would not have arrived in Las Cruces. And without Las Cruces, she would not have been at Rosalie's when Gideon came with his hat in his hands and his desperate request. And without that request, she would never have sat in that chair by that bed in that sick room and opened that book and begun to read to the most infuriating, contained, honest, precise, completely extraordinary man she had ever met. Who was, at this very moment, walking across the yard from the barn in the early evening light, his boots still dusty from the day, and his hat pushed back on his head exactly the way she remembered from the first day she saw him in the general store. His face tipped slightly toward the house as he walked, looking for her through the window. She raised her hand in the window, and he saw her, and the expression that moved across his face was the one she had been watching for 4 years, and never tired of. The one that came in the moment he saw her before his composure had time to reassemble itself. She went to the door and opened it as he came up the porch steps. "The boys are in the kitchen," she said. "Thomas has achieved some ambition with the flower situation that you should probably know about before you go in." "What kind of ambition?" he said. "The exploratory kind," she said. He looked at her. "Are you handling it?" "I handled it," she said. "I am now reporting it." He stepped past her through the door, and she followed him into the kitchen where Thomas, who was 4, was sitting at the table with the combined expression of someone who has done something wonderful and is aware it was also not allowed. Henry, who was 2, was in his high chair and covered in flour for purely solidarity reasons, not having been old enough to participate, but having clearly been in the vicinity. Vance looked at his sons. He looked at the flour. He looked at Zelda with the expression of a man who is not going to say anything dramatic about this, but is making several internal observations. "Thomas," he said. "The bread," Thomas began. "The bread is made by your mother," Vance said. "Not by the floor. I was helping," Thomas said. "I can see that," Vance said. He lifted Henry from the high chair, which resulted in a significant flour transfer to his shirt, and held him with the unself-conscious ease of a man completely comfortable with this particular small person. And Thomas slid from the table chair and wrapped himself around Vance's legs as children do, with the complete and unpredictable urgency of affection. Zelda watched her family in the kitchen in the evening light and felt the whole of the past 4 years present in the moment, not as nostalgia but as depth, the way a river has depth because of all the water that has flowed through it. They ate dinner. They cleaned the flour, a project of some scope. Zelda bathed the boys in the tin tub in front of the fire and read them a different story from the one she read to Vance, simpler and brighter, full of adventures that Thomas narrated along with her from memory, and Henry received with the wide-eyed attention of someone for whom the world is still entirely new. When the boys were asleep, she came back to the main room where Vance was in his chair with a book open on his knee, not reading but waiting, with the patience of a man who has learned that the good things in his life are worth the wait. She sat in her chair. She picked up the book that she had left there that morning, a novel she had been meaning to get to for weeks, and opened it to the first page. The fire was low but warm. The lamp was steady between them. The ranch outside was quiet in the way of a place that is thoroughly alive and simply resting. "What are we reading?" he asked. She showed him the cover. He looked at it and nodded once with the considered approval he gave to things he knew nothing about but was willing to encounter. "Begin," he said. She began. Her voice in the warm room was the same voice it had always been, steady and full and entirely capable of carrying a story. And he listened the way he had always listened, from that first evening in the sick room, when he had chosen not to make her stop, with the total and focused attention of a man for whom this is not entertainment, but something more necessary than that. She read until the fire needed building up and he built it, and she read through the new flames and the warmth they threw, and Thomas made a small sound from the back room that settled back into silence, and Henry did not stir, and the mountains stood outside in the dark as they always stood, permanent and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the small, precise happiness of the Doubleback Ranch. But the happiness was real. It was specific and complete, and it was theirs, built out of a broken cattleman and a woman with a book, and the specific decision, made on an evening in October 1881, to sit down in a chair and begin reading to someone who had told her to leave. It was built on that, and on the evenings that followed, and on the slow, brave work of two people choosing honesty over safety and presence over protection. It was built on words, many thousands of them, her voice and his responses and the conversations that wound through the readings like a river finding its natural channel. It was built on the land that lent itself to them, the New Mexico sky that had more space in it than seemed reasonable, the cattle moving in the morning light, the ridge to the east where everything could be seen at once, and the world seemed both very large and, somehow, exactly the right size for two people who had found each other. Many years later, Thomas Prout, who grew into a man with his mother's precision, and his father's stubbornness, and a great love of books that he could not entirely explain except to say that his earliest memories were of the sound of reading aloud, would ask his mother to tell him how she and his father had met. It was a story he knew, because it was a story she had told, but he liked hearing it repeated and had since childhood. She told it the way she always told it, the foreman with his hat in his hands, the long dusty drive out to the ranch, the man in the bed who told her to get out, the 45 minutes of reading to someone who sat perfectly still and did not ask her to stop. And then what? Thomas always asked, though he knew. And then I came back the next evening, she always said, and the evening after that. And then we read ourselves right into each other, she said, until it was impossible to read us apart. Vance, if he was in the room for this telling, which he usually was because his family occupied the rooms of his house with the comfortable permanence of people who belong there, would say nothing. He would look at her with the expression that had been on his face in varying intensities since October of 1881, the one that required no words to communicate its full content. The fire in the evenings was always warm and the lamp between the chairs was always steady, and she always read and he always listened, until the last page of one book closed and the first page of another opened, and the story continued, as good stories do, for as long as there was light enough to see the words.